I'm really happy you appreciate the title, because I do think also that it's a nice way to start a presentation by evoking the film of Bob Fosse, Cabaret, and mostly the wonderful performance of Liza Minnelli in the cited movie. So yes, let's start. And before starting, I'd like to say also that I'm really happy that my presentation has been preceded by Maria Giulia and Professor Maria Giulia Dondero and Professor Massimo presentation, because as you will see, there are different kinds of evocation that you will find in my presentation that has already been commented and analyzed by the two professors. So let's start. If semiotics is the discipline that studies everything that can be used to lie, as stated by Umberto Eco in his A Theory of Semiotics, in today's digital and automated iconosphere, resorting to this discipline, to our discipline, can help to entangle the reality effect that can be conferred on a visual fake as the counterpart of a visual authenticity when it conceals its content of falsity while presenting itself as a fact. Surely it would not cost us to realize that the entire history of human species has been confronted with fake, and mostly with fake representation of reality, triggering a cognitive retroalimentation between fiction and perception. But equally surely, it will not cost us to realize that today we are confronted with a visual culture where fakes and forgeries are conditioned by non-human intentionality, specifically artificial and automated agencies that act in the digital context of the promise of a peculiar hyper-transparent effect of reality, using and manipulating the words of Louise Morin that we can see here in this really nice portrait in his studio. So in this regard, and following Morin, and precisely his work on visual enunciation, where he formulated the distinction between the transparency and the opacity in painting, that is the difference between the representation and the presentation of the representation, just to put it very, very quickly, we can affirm that the general trend within the digital and automated iconosphere is to consider the visual fake as hyper-transparent enunciation, a representation of a reality with no doubt about its authenticity. If we just bear in mind the recently appear technosocial factors and actors like deepfakes, we can affirm that these synthetic media technologies that use artificial intelligence and particularly machine learning represent an hyper-transparent effect of reality, concealing its material and fictional enunciation. Let's quickly think of a concrete example. Since the most remote times, arts have always been a privileged field for the reproduction and the production of the suspension of these beliefs, and therefore for the understanding of the effect of reality, thanks to our capability for creating and using simulacra of the world. And if we now think about the uses and the application of artificial intelligence in the field of arts, that's called AI art, we see how our perception and fruition with the works of art is confronted with rather complex effects. As pointed out by Professor Massimo Leone in his recent paper, Semioethics of Visual Fake, in the case of the illusions resulted by the trompe-l'oeil, we just see two maybe of the most known example of trompe-l'oeil, the one in Mantua, the Camera Picta by Mantegna, and the 400 years later work of art by Per Borrell del Caso, Escaping Criticism. So, in the case of the illusions resulted by the trompe l'oeil, the effect of reality is maximum, and we witness to the substitution of the image that represents a reality with a reality that represents itself, that becomes to the eye of the observer the reality of itself. And continuing with Professor Leone, we can say that much of the most recent technological change in the field of visual representation and visualization aims at even more skillful instances of trompe l'oeil. The proliferation of deepfakes that transparently promise the reality effect opens up to new questions concerning both automated and embodied visual forgeries. What I will try to do in this presentation today is thought to recur to a piece of AR art, thanks to which make emerging qualitative and quantitative contemporary trends when representing and portraying human and human identity with a particular focus on human faces by using deepfakes. While we are constantly getting used to transparently seeing better through AI, through artificial intelligence, the work of art that I will take in consideration opts for an exuberant opacity, an opacity out of place in the enunciation of gender identity within the framework of facial representation. In semiotic terms, and precisely from a Peircean perspective, reality is always perceived according to some habits negotiated by and through social interactions that give rise to a perceptual judgment within a community of interpreters. The concept of habit is a key concept for Peirce and for Peircean semiotics, and for the interpretation of the process of incorporation of the experience in the context of intersubjective relations. Continuing with Peirce, we can affirm that the effect of reality that deepfakes produce when concealing its falsity is both due to a cultural construction, the outer world, and to a physiological construction, the inner world. This is alike the case of the effect of visual continuity that the porch of the Ospedale degli Innocenti, designed by Brunelleschi, produced in the 15th century, and which today we are hardly able to grasp because we are used to other visual habits, to other effort of reality, to other perception, other technologies. So an unprecedented suspension of these beliefs happened under the porch in the Renaissance. The subject has to decide what to perceive as authentic, whether to believe the outer world or whether to believe the inner world. And the subject has to choose because through the eyes, it was possible one perception while the spatiality organized another. The spatiality was and still is organized thanks to the parallel lines of the floor and of the wall that remains with that composition until the end of the gallery. But the eyes, and on the other hand, and the eyes of our subject in the Renaissance, said that the parallel lines of the floor is prolonged to infinity. It is a deep negotiation of a fake visuality we cannot perceive today, but is widely documented in the writings of the epoch. From this point of view, Brunelleschi's project is the beginning, or at least this is my hypothesis, of the projective and latent space, a space with a predominance of indexical iconicity that depends above all on distances, that is on the metric relationship that exists between things themselves. So we will go back to this latency concerning the spatiality in machine learning and generative networks. But before, let's go back to semiotics. Peirce introduces the two categories that I mentioned before, the inner word and the outer word, for accounting the experiences incorporated through the diachronic and synchronic repetitions capable of transforming themselves into true awareness of consciousness. The interactions between the inner world and the outer world are interpretations that, even not completely conscious, can acquire these characteristics. Habits are, in this regard, not exactly beliefs, but rather beliefs can give rise to habits. And according to Peirce, the repetition of muscular and physiological effort in the outer world form a disposition, whereas the reiteration of mental efforts in the inner world creates an association. And we can read. To my apprehensions, consciousness may be defined as that congeries of non-relative predicates, varying greatly in quality and in intensity, which are symptomatic of the interaction of the outer world, the world of those causes that are exceedingly compulsive upon the modes of consciousness, with general disturbance, something amounting to shock, and are acted upon only slightly and wholly by a special kind of effort, muscular effort. And of the inner world, apparently derived from the outer and amenable to direct effort of various kinds of feeble reactions. The interaction of these two worlds chiefly consisting of a direct action of the outer world upon the inner and an indirect action of the inner world upon the outer through the operation of habits. If these be a correct account of consciousness, that is, of the congeries of feelings, it seems to me that it exercises a real function in self-control, since without it, or at least without that of which it is symptomatic, the results and exercises of inner world could not affect the real determination of and habits of the outer world. I say that these belong to the outer world because they are not mere fantasies, but are real agencies. So the premises for rethinking the habit that determines a perception together with the experience of the perception itself are the result of the direct action of the external world on the internal world and the possibility of an indirect action of the latter on the external world. The conglomeration that results from this interaction exerts an effect on the perception of reality, because otherwise the action of the internal world could not exert any influence on the determination exerted by the external world. In this sense, the habit tends to recognize experiences and strategically organize visions and action by adapting or rebelling against the effect of reality that circulates in a determined society. For example, while visiting the porch of dell'Ospedale degli Innocenti in the 15th century, what is seen is the reality of a visual infinity as a reality itself and not the result of an iconic illusion of a continuity as we can perceive it today. So the reality effect is therefore both the negotiation of habits and the negotiation of stimuli. Since we are used to that effect of reality, it seems real. And at the same time, it is in dialogue with the physiology of human perception. The iconicity is, in this sense, the negotiation of both a symbolic and an indexical sign, thinking in a semiotic perspective. This negotiation is also where the synthetic technologies that give rise to deepfakes are installed. Deepfakes dialogue with the transparent genealogy of Western visual culture and produce reality effects that are plausible to our eyes. But they introduce a slightly new nuance of meaning. Deepfake, with all possible tools, conceal their enunciative opacity, the presentation of the representation in the terms of Marin. However, this concealment is not without consequences, and these primarily concern the possibility of representation and access to contemporary visual culture. Among the most jealously guarded opaque dimension of deepfakes is certainly the architecture and the organization of data. Since 2014, the technological advances gave artificial intelligence a new capacity, that of creating images ex novo, thanks to the diffusion of machine learning and generative adversarial networks, with strong and almost indiscernible suspension of disbelief. Nevertheless, just 7 years later, it is already well known that machine learning suspends all the beliefs in artificial intelligence, since it is prone to reinforce and reproduce social bias, making this technology neither completely artificial nor intelligent. Multiple studies have shown how this has already led to nefarious consequences for the non-hegemonic communities. Not only can racism be amplified, but also ableism and sexism. With respect to such social concern, one of the main flaws that this technology is that their functioning relies on data which the training set might be reproduce human values and biopolitical limitation. This is why with the collection of data, hegemonic power structures are often reified. In this context, and exactly trying to make visible the invisibility of this data structure, we can situate the ZZ Show, an interactive digital drag cabaret project. It is a deepfake drag act that allows the creation of a bespoke drag experience on a virtual stage. The project, realized by the multimedia artist and coder Jake Elwis with the financiation of Edinburgh Institute of Technology AI, aims to tackle the lack of diversity in the training dataset used by neural networks. In this regard, the dataset of the project was made by training a machine learning system with portraits of different drag persons with peculiar and particular attention on the face reproduction as a territory where to stage and perform the identity. This causes the weights inside the neural network to shift away from the normative rhetoric of authenticity of the face the neural network was originally trained on, into a space of queerness, a fake face. This shift is capable of happening thanks to some particular characteristic of deep neural networks technology. First of all, deepfakes are intended in the ZZ Show as disembodied identities that can be controlled by a dataset of movements. This disembodied dimension is further put in contact with the genre dimension of drag performance as a constructed and exorbitant reproduction of the identity, capable of showing a shift about the politics of the conventional and the unconventional in the governability of gender identities and bodies. So this shift occurs in the latent space, that is an abstract mathematical representation of detected features in the training data of the neural network. From multiple points in this space that hold feature information, artificial images can be generated. As deep neural networks can learn underlying patterns in complex data, this can be taken a step further by designing algorithms that can explore the latent possibility of the learned distribution to produce original example of data without using any design rule, but still producing a differential effect of reality. So the latent space is in this sense an indexical iconicity spatiality where an image is possible to move from potential to actuality in semiotic terms, since it is installed in the virtual space of creation that defines the coordinates of all possible outputs. Like the generative grammar of a language is not limited to the set of utterances it can produce, neither is the latent space. It is a generative space, not a database, a space characterized by a layered approach to analyzing any given input, where the analysis begins with a very basic feature, as for example, ages and angles, to increasingly move high-level ones, for example, noses or eyes. The latent space is the most high-level conceptual compression of the input data, the pre-final step before the neural network's output. So this spatiality is, in this regard, invisible to human because of its complexity. So, for example, the latent space in neural network typically will be an hypersphere with around 100 dimensions. However, and here we are getting closer to our ZZ show. However, when a neural network is trained, it narrows the possibility space and therefore the pertinence of the visual patterns. If latency space is very narrow, it simply reproduces the input. If it's too wide, the model will produce all kinds of nonsensical output. For the creation of the deepfake drag performances, the ZZ show narrowed the latent space of an existing neural network for face recognition, whose dataset of faces was largely homogeneous and contained a significant Western bias. The latent space of the dataset was then injected with 1,000 images of drag kings and queens as a way of challenging gender and exploring the pertinences of facialities when reproducing gender identities. This caused the network to generate exorbitant and out-of-place facialities and bodies. The result is an opaque and always changing mostrification of the face, capable of focusing on the aporia between gender and genre as a performing technology of the identity. The opacity of the latent space of the dataset used in the ZZ show allowed the shift of the facial in-between representation that doesn't exist in the real world. By making the latent space of the dataset visible, the ZZ show allowed to rethink the habit that determines the pertinence of gender identification in face perception at the times of deepfakes. Thus, there exists a minimum visual pattern of gender identity when displayed on the face. This is one of the first experiments that J.K. Lewis, the coder and the artist, made in the latent space. So, the recognition of an artificial aesthetic can be considered as the result of the direct action of the outer world on the inner world. On the one hand, the performative experience of gender that passes from potentiality to actuality only to the extent that is performed can be considered the indirect action of the inner world on the outer world. Furthermore, this last dimension is underlined by the performative simulation of the genre experience of Cabaret. In this deepfake aporia between gender and genre, the exorbitant and abnormal faciality can be read as the artificial performance of a mostrification whose anomaly constitutes a warning, recovering the Latin meaning of the verb moneo that signifies to warn. So intended, the exorbitant deepfake drag monstrum that performs in the ZZ show can be interpreted as a warning about biopolitics, life marked by a shift out of data normativity. So, for concluding, I'd like to show you the ZZ show.
Please welcome to the stage your host for the evening.
Can you just confirm me you're listening? Because it's quite important, the audio as well.
the world.
Yes, we can hear it.
Okay, perfect.
Mesdames and messieurs, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone between and beyond the binary, welcome to the ZZ Show. An interactive digital drag cabaret where from performer to performance, you get to choose your show. Through the magic and mystery of artificial intelligence, we will create a deep, fake, bespoke drag experience especially for you on our virtual stage. Now, my darlings, AI systems often inherit the bias of the cis-white heteronormative patriarchy that controls us. Shortly, it'll be over to you to make your first decisions of the show, but before that, let's explain how all this shit works. A drag show is not a drag show without a quick change. And you can do this at any point by simply clicking the quick change button. But for those of you who would like a little bit more control in their life, select the performer button and choose from our pool of tremendously talented drag artists. We're gorgeous, we get it. And you can get up close and personal by simply clicking the zoom in button. Or, to return to the full-length fantasy, press it again to zoom out. Now, if at any point you do get really bored with the song, then click the skip button to give us the chop, and I'll be back to help you choose your next number. So without further ado, that's French, sit back, relax, get your clicking fingers at the ready as we begin the ZZ Show!
Of the virtual ZZ Cabaret drag show, and if you just want to have a look, you can go to zz.ai and have the drag deepfake monstrum experience. And I thank you. I'd like to thank you for your attention. My presentation is finished.